Welcome to Exploring the EthnoGothic. I'm Dr. Eric Wesselman.
And I'm Dr. Stanford Carpenter. And in this series, we explore the intersection between horror, race, social identity, and culture.
For today's special guest, we are joined by Mr. John Jennings, a professor of media and cultural studies at the University of California at Riverside. Mr. Jennings is also an author, graphic novelist, curator, Harvard Fellow, New York Times bestseller, 2018 Eisner winner, and all-around champion of Black culture. Relevant to today's discussion, he regularly teaches a course on race and horror. Mr. Jennings, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk about all this scary stuff.
Excellent. Well, so let's just go ahead and get started. So Professor Jennings and Dr. Carpenter, tell me how the origin story of the term ethnogothic that you two came up with.
Let's see.
Well,
yeah, you go first.
Well, we could start with, there was alcohol involved, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably like a bottle of wine probably was involved. And maybe pizza or wings, or pizza and wings. I don't even remember. But,
all I know is it started in the kitchen, the three of us, you, myself, and Yatasha Womack. Remember, because she was talking about working on her book on Afrofuturism at the time. And and we had a long conversation with her. And then towards the end of the conversation, we started talking about like how encompassing could Afrofuturism be? And then the conversation continued, and we're like, okay, you know, Afrofuturism it's all about optimism and looking forward, but there's a lot of stuff that's out there that's not about that. Like they're like looking at stuff having to do with just straight up the imagination, and also with the way, you know, using horror to process trauma. Right. And I mean, I remember shooting around a whole bunch of different terms, and we started with the term and then kind of moved from there.
Yeah. I think at first it was like we was thinking about Afro-Gothic, and then, you know, we started thinking about race more as like an object. And so that actually kind of led us to thinking about it from a ethnographic standpoint, I think. And that's kind of like where the term kind of germinated from, you know, because it starts to open up the conversation a lot more. And the other thing was, we started looking at narratives that get couched under Afrofuturism all the time, because, you know, I think at the time the term was popping off, and people were kind of just shoving everything that was like speculative and Black under Afrofuturism, you know. And, you know, Stanford and I were like, well, what about issues around genre? You know what I'm saying? I mean, so, you know, right. And, yeah, there are things that there are tropes that relate to different genres that don't necessarily think about, you know, sci-fi or futurist attitudes, and something like a Kindred, for instance, which times travel story, but actually has more like Gothic tropes. So those are some of the things that we started like parsing out when we came up with the term. And this, you know, was still at the time of work, and it probably still is like a work in progress, actually, as far as like theorizing, thinking about where things fit in it, you know.
The other thing I remember distinctly, you know, because we went back and forth also when we were talking about using Afro was that it felt kind of cliched, right?
Yeah.
You know, and you know, even though we love the use of Afro in a lot of the spaces that it gets used, we just were like, okay, you know, what is race? And then you know, ethno was short for ethnographic, but also, you know, was to highlight the root for ethnographic, which is the term ethno, which actually means culture.
Right.
Yeah, no, I love these points you're making about how to sort of, the trick with any sort of genre, right, is how do you carve out a space that is something that most folks can agree upon would fit in there, but is also flexible enough to deal with those ambiguities, those differences of opinion, to deal with the cases that, you know, a lot of stories will straddle different genres, right?
Yeah.
And hybrids,
Yeah.
and these things change, like culture. These things change over time,
That's
right?
right.
So you want something that's a space that's flexible enough to accommodate that.
Hmm. Yeah, I like the idea of flexibility because I think having like a mutable kind of shape shifting, term or like space to work in really fits what we're talking about to a certain degree. Um, there are these things around Afrofuturism looking to the thinking with it being like a kind of a theory around time and how time functions is something we talk a lot about. Like Afrofuturism as a space looks at the past and the future and tries to think about like reimagining what those futures could be, or even creating futures. Because a lot of times, in sci-fi narratives, Black folk or people of color in general aren't there, and so those are some of the things we're challenging. But also, you know, um, these haunted spaces that deal with particular types of trauma are really reified, I think, in a lot of these horror spaces. So that's something that we were thinking about too. I always use the Erykah Badu song "Bag Lady" as an example. And so, in the narrative of Erykah Badu's Bag Lady, she's watching a homeless woman with bags struggle with the bags. She's trying to catch a bus, right? And so the narrative is about letting go of those things that are in the bag so she can be light enough to catch the bus. So the way I think about it is like, well, in those bags are like oppression and slavery and Jim Crow and all these different things, different types of traumatic things that are in those sacks that are weighing her down. And so basically I'm like, well, name those things so you can control them, or like, get those monsters out the bag, kill them so we can get on the bus, and the bus is going into the Afro future. You know what I'm saying? So it's like trying to exercise the demons that have afflicted us so we can move forward without having those things weigh us down, I think is the utility of talking about, the ethnogothic and horror and race. So
At the same time, it also captures like when you start talking about it in terms of horror, we start talking about slavery as being like as being embodied, and as a monster is, one of the ongoing tropes in horror is the return, right? Like just when you think it's dead, it comes back. Right. And that's also how some of these things function. That's how, just when you think slavery is in the past, it gets reiterated in some way, right? Like even now in a political context, right? There's debates over we're having debates over slavery again, right? Yeah. So even though the irony is, even though it may be something that as a group African Americans may be trying to like set down, it still gets resurrected and oftentimes through no fault of their own.
Right. No, that's totally true. And then, we talk about these issues around epigenetic trauma and like group trauma, right? And there's a lot of studies around like how trauma like literally like affects your DNA and can be passed down chemically, through generations, right? And so there are some pushbacks from people who are dealing with like traumatic episodes, and how the exploitation of Black trauma and horror is something that has been discussed, but then again, some of those people don't understand like the functions of horror in general too. But is it saying that Black trauma is special in a particular way, or is are Black people not strong enough to actually like look at something and deal with it from a not only entertainment standpoint, but also from what it's saying about like our place in society, historically and socially. So yeah, so those are some of the things that we wrestle with as horror fans who are working in this space and trying to actually think about like, well, how is this useful? So
well, there's also questions of agency, right? I mean, yeah. It's not just can you consume something, it's should you want to, right. Should you have to, and so I think the agency does become really important when we start talking about that. But I also think in terms of, in general, like if we talk about, Black horror, right? The question, I think what it brings up is that horror is different for different people.
Yeah.
And different peoples. The example I always bring up is when you have that scene where the police show up, oftentimes for African Americans, that's scarier than the monster, right? And that leads to a very different reading of certain types of situations and certain types of stories. It brings up different kinds of memories, and it brings up different kinds of histories. And so the question becomes like should someone be forced to engage that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I want to sort of to take some of what both you're saying and draw this thread together, because one of the things that has been serving as a foundation for the class that Stanford and I are developing, and the series, is the work by Dr. Robin Means Coleman,
Mm-hmm.
horror noir. And one of the things that she talks about in that book is this discussion of trauma porn, right? Which is a broader umbrella, which could talk about racialized trauma or sexualized trauma, etc. In this context, the films that she discusses are films that deal with racialized trauma, and it seems to be there's a big debate about should, can, how, where is the line. And I know that in some of the work that you all contributed to for the newer Candyman study guide, also discuss that, where is that line between dealing with trauma but not re-traumatizing the audience? So can you talk a little bit more about those discussions, the tensions?
Yeah, I mean, they get like really heated. I mean, there's some people, for instance, there was a show called Them, on Amazon Prime, that a lot of people were citing as being overly traumatic. When I watched it though, I found some utility in some of the things it was saying about like generational trauma, but also metaphorically talking about like racism and its the gifts, if you will, that it's left America. You know what I'm saying? I think for me, I think it's about like how, and it started me thinking about like different tenets as far as like how do you write something. If you're going to put a Black family through something like that, then I think that there should be a resolution. You know what I'm saying? There should be some type of positive resolution. And I started thinking about like, well, what are tools that we can actually kind of enact in talking about these things? Because there's a lot of pushback on them, but then again, also trauma is actually one of the steps of horror. You know what I'm saying? So it's like trauma is actually part of the horror genre, because you have things like the initial dread of something happening, you have the repulsion aspects where, a lot of times when you're involved in a horror space, you have someone like retching or like reacting to something through an odor or something like that, because that's when the horror is actually like physically manifesting. And then you have some type of either physical trauma or mental trauma that actually results in the terrifying aspects, And of course, horror itself is the thing that you're left with. It's the thought of what has happened sticking with you. If it's a good horror movie, then you're thinking about it for the next couple of days, right? So that's part of the genre conventions. And so, I think, and this is something I've thought about a lot, I think that because of the uptick in speculative fiction by and about people of color and about Black folk, we're not used to being seen as much. We're not used to it yet. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, we haven't had a chance to really deal with like, oh man, look at all this Black stuff. I mean, there's, what I'm saying? Like just over the last, just in this summer, you had The Blackening came out, The Angry Girl and Her Monster, right? And then you have like two major films with like Black leads, which is Last Voyage of the Demeter and also, Talk to Me, right? And then also like an independent film called A Southern Haunting, that actually stars the same young lady from the angry Black girl and a monster. So it's like there's a serious like renaissance of like people making these films, right? And I think that we're still processing the fact that Black people are front and center in these conversations now, and people are still learning how to think about and talk about horror from that standpoint. And I think that's part of it, So if you're a horror fan, then I can watch a Saw movie and then think about the social implications of it, because obviously the filmmakers are actually, it seems like they're pretty progressive, because the people who are getting sawed up are like racists and people who are cheating who are cheating poor people out of healthcare. You know what I'm saying? These are the people that are being chopped up by society. Hostel, for instance, by what's his name?
Eli Roth.
Yeah, that's about like the number, the 1%, like devouring and chewing up and using the rest of us for sport. You know, Green Inferno is about the what do you call it? The oh, I forgot the name of it. The industry around like nonprofit industry. You know, so the idea of nonprofit as an industry. So it's like these are very smart films that disguise as like these gory things, but you know, there is horror by itself is a very diverse genre. You know what I'm saying? And so, you know, The Blackening is a very clever like horror satire around constructions of race. You know, so stuff like that. I think that once people really sit with what these people are saying, they see the utilities of horror. And I think those kinds of conversations have to happen. And that's why we have classes around race and horror to start with. And so,
Stanford, what are some of your thoughts?
You know, I mean, I don't want to quite go point by point, but I think it's interesting that you brought up Them. You know, I thought that Them was like one of those instances where they kind of went a little too far, right? I mean, because I think that you know, Lovecraft Country had come out, you know, and you saw sort of a real playing on race and really bringing up racialized horror. But I felt like Them was just, I did feel like they overdid it a little bit.
mm-hmm.
I think that you're, but I also think that you're right. You know, that we're not talking enough about what it means to be seen the way African Americans have been seen. It's not just this summer, but think about everything leading into this summer. And then if you pick up on some of our conversations where we talk about race as horror, right? You know, what was the pandemic? What was COVID? But also the shadow of George Floyd, but not just
Mm-hmm.
George Floyd. George Floyd was one of many, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
And so existing in that shadow, and then for a while, and then being brought literally from the shadow being brought into the light. I'm also thinking about the about Candyman, the most recent version of Candyman, where they literally reimagine the monster for our time. And it's interesting the way they reimagine the monster, because they really do. I really do feel like it's like, oh wait, you know, Candyman is horrifying and it's really cool, and it's slipped from being horror to folklore, right? And so it's like and the way in which they did it was they said Candyman can exist more in folklore now because we have a new Candyman that is a whole other kind of horror, right? That's still connected to the original Candyman, but it shows the continuum, and it shows Candyman as being part of a continuum, or each iteration of Candyman being part
almost
of
like a mantle, like a you know, it has this kind of legacy character aspect to it, which is, you know, the new Candyman almost feels like a dark Avenger, like superhero story in some way. Just it's an origin story, you know. It's like, wow, you know. Anyway, but yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
So
there's so much of what you said, Stanford, that like I could take these in all these different directions. But I love the you used the term, you know, you talked about the new Candyman, the reimagining, right? And the connection between horror and folklore, which has probably always been there, right? John mentioned folk horror, right? And that's
folk horror,
having sort of a renaissance.
Yes,
horror,
very much so. I was just agreeing with you. Go ahead.
Okay. You know, and John, you made the point before that horror is a diverse genre, right? I mean, so when you look at the psychology of horror, which I've started to move into in my career, you know, there's a lot that unites us pan-culturally in what scares us, right? There are some core things that we're all afraid of, but there's also so many elements of fear that are contextually emergent through time, geographic location, intersection of all of those things, right? The reimagining of Candyman, you know, some of the things that are going to be scary are going to be different depending upon who is creating it, who is observing it, and when, right? And so it's just a real complex dynamics that I love to dive into.
Right. Yeah, all of these things are true. I think. Yeah, the thing with Shudder just produced an excellent documentary on folk horror, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and our colleague Maisha Wester is in it, and so she definitely talks about like, you know, Black folk horror. You know, so she's looking at stuff like the Skeleton Key and Candyman and, you know, Eve's Bayou and things of that nature. And it's a really wonderful segment. I show it to my students, and yeah, it really does. It does a great job of looking at folk horror from around the world. Um, it's interesting too, because when we think about like constructions of race, I mean, particularly like in when we start thinking about horror, we start to realize that race itself is this cursed artifact to a certain degree, right? It starts to become like that. And I started thinking about this differently when I read Racecraft by the Field sisters.
Okay.
I think it's Barbara and Linda. The Fields. There's two sisters. Their last name is Fields, and they basically talk about this idea that race starts to act like a spell because so much of it actually is about belief, you know. And I thought that was really interesting, and that's why they call it racecraft, right? It's like, you know, these strange happenings that come from just you believing in a thing, right? And so what I did then, I started thinking about racecraftian horror as well. You know, like what are the tenets of that? Like taking the idea of the cosmic and actually internalizing it, and started to think about that as a new aesthetic that is springing out of these ideas of EthnoGothic, but also starting to branch out into its own types of meanderings. You know, it's something that I could send y'all that essay. I did an essay about it in the Bitterroot for Bitterroot actually, and just kind of just beginning to muse what those things are, you know. It's honestly too, and this is something just as an aside, like being like the editor for the Bitterroot volumes, and actually there's a lot of like theoretical like philosophy and stuff that's been worked out in the back pages of Bitterroot, which I've been very excited about. You know, some of the top scholars just coming in there and just talking about this stuff, you know. So that's been fun. But anyway, so those are some of the newer things I'm thinking about, like, because, you know, like you mentioned Lovecraft Country, right? So Lovecraft Country and some of the stuff that Victor LaValle has done with like Destroyer, but also, you know, the Ballad of Black Tom and Up from Slavery and stuff like that. There's a new renaissance of people of color actually like sampling and remixing H.P. Lovecraft's work too, which I find very fascinating. You know, so that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah, I remember reading, I can't remember the scholar off the top of my head, but I do remember running across an essay called like Hacking Lovecraft, I think was the title. It's all about this idea of how do you reclaim the sort of key aspects of the cosmic horror and, you know, either remove or reimagine the sort of racist components of Lovecraft to tell a different story.
Yes. Yeah, it's like remixing. There was a whole like segment too, and I'm looking for it now. Yeah. So, but no, those are some interesting things that I think are happening right now. And now we're seeing things that have horror tinge to it, like even something like They Clone Tyrone, which I feel is excellent, has these really interesting like Gothic or like neo-Gothic tones to it. The idea of cloning a Black body for you know, to in that particular narrative is so like terrifying, but also like or horrific. There's different segments of that movie, even though it's like some of it's hilarious and action packed, are just heartbreakingly dreadful. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah. So yeah.
But it's also what I think is interesting is that like cloning is kind of like the science fiction version of the doppelganger.
That's right.
You know, but we don't. I mean, even though like if you say it, you get it. We oftentimes, you know, exist in the state of cognitive distance where we forget that the doppelganger and the clone are kind of the same. You know
Yes.
what I mean? They're the same. It's the same concept, right? And
Yeah,
has
that's right.
the
It's just it's
potential
just
to,
it's just the speculative aspect of it is different, right? You know what I'm saying?
yes,
Yeah, because you can even say like the android or like the
Uh,
or something like that is not as is not exactly like the clone, but it's this idea of like the shadow self or like you said, the doppelganger. It
right.
is a part of
Or
that.
the android and the golem.
The golem. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's very much. Yep.
um, and depending upon how these narratives are told, right? There's sort of and there can be some that involve race, and there can some that involve class, and both but there's also sort of an exploitation element that shows up in a lot of these. So I think back to uh, Karl Čapek's play Rossum's Universal Robots,
Hmm.
which was all about that they weren't mechanical; they were essentially clones, but they were
Right.
created to do the work for everyone. And then there was an uprising,
Right.
and there was another film which we could also talk about this a variant of that perhaps in Get Out, right?
Hmm.
It's not exactly cloning per se, but the idea of taking over someone's identity made me think of the movie called Pieces: The Clonus Horror, which was I think
Oh
later
yeah.
made as The Island,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
which had
Yeah.
more of a class-based element. But yeah, this idea of we're going to the privileged are going to exploit and take to some degree an identity
Hmm.
of the disenfranchised, the minoritized.
Yeah, yes. I mean, and you have other movies and stories like Altered Carbon, right? Where like the privileged can actually create sleeves and live forever because they can just upload their consciousness. And you also there's a German film actually about these older white German people who actually take over these Black immigrants' bodies too. Yeah, I've not seen it, but I came across it in my research. There's a whole section in my horror class about like what I it's this idea of slipping in and out of bodies, you know what I'm saying? And so because there's like the Skeleton Key is like that as well. The new movie Spell is actually like that as well. We have like people who are utilizing magic to take over bodies. There's a
Mm.
film called Jezebel that does the same thing, so it's really interesting stuff. Even the Soul Collector, there's aspect to it as well. Like the South African film, there's a little bit of that too. So it's an interesting trope as far as like you said, thinking about the physical body and the spirit
Right.
and the mutability of identity in these racialized bodies. Good Madam even I think deals with that a little bit too. Which is another South African film. So it's people are dealing with this from all over the place. Yeah.
So let's pivot a bit. You both worked on um, Box of Bones,
Mhm.
right? And so let's unpack the Box of Bones a little bit more
Okay.
uh, about what what were the ideas behind it? What types of stories did you want to tell using that framework?
Okay. Well, like I said, Stanford and I had already kind of laid out different tenets of what the ethnogothic was becoming, and it's probably still becoming even. And I was introduced to Ayize Jama Everett by my friend Lee Rayford, who teaches at Berkeley. They're really good friends. So that's how we met. And so we kind of hit it off. And Ayize is a really talented speculative fiction writer in his own right, and we just wanted to figure out what we wanted to collaborate on. And so I had, I think, 5 story ideas that I had whittled down that I pitched to him. And he picked a couple, and one of them was Box of Bones. At the time, it was called Shadow Box, though, by the way. It wasn't called Box of Bones. We changed the title later when we were thinking about Henry Dumas's work. So it's a wink to Henry Dumas's Ark of Bones, which, by the way, which should be on that list too. By the way, his work in general. So yeah, then I was talking to Ronaldo Anderson, and he was like, "Hey, you need to do something, a horror story that's based off of Black Dada Nihilismus, which is this beat poem by Amiri Baraka, and the whole thing, and it's like to jazz and stuff like that, and the whole thing is like about Black people becoming the stereotype. Like, oh, if you're just going to judge me on this particular level, then I'm just going to become the thing that you're scared of, and just destroy everything." So it's a nihilistic Black story, poem, right? and it's to jazz. It's really like just acid jazz and just, you know, Amiri Baraka doing Amiri Baraka. And that was kind of like, those were the components. And then we started thinking about like cursed artifacts and, you know, Hellraiser and things of that nature, right? And like the foreboding nature of what's in that. And so the whole thing was about, well, what if there is no justice for all these, you know, mothers and fathers and families losing children to cops, you know, that kind of, or to just different types of violence. And when I first came up with the idea, it was just going to be in the United States, you know, because that's what I'm comfortable with. I'm from one of the most racially violent states in the Union, Mississippi, right? Right now, they're dealing with like renegade racist cops right now, you know, in Rankin County. So the Goon Squad, right? Just like right now in the news, right? So, but then when I talked to Ize, he was like, well, no, what about the diaspora? What if we actually look at the diaspora? So we started thinking about these creatures that represented very common Black fears, but in the forms of these like stereotypical, it's like almost taking like Black stereotypes and pushing them to the edge, what it could be. I think so. All of these different monsters, they represent very real Black fears, and they feel culturally, they feel like they could be real. You know what I'm saying? And so when we designed them, we wanted them to have like a silhouette that you could notice in the dark. You know, and actually one of the characters is called the Dark, and he's kind of like the representation of Jim Crow. He's kind of like a pinhead character. You know, he's kind of the leader. There's a character called the Burden that it represents, you know, chattel slavery. It's a giant like cotton sack filled with, you know, Black arms and legs, and it crawls around like an inchworm. It's terrifying. You know, it's probably the one that bothers me the most. There's a sentient lynching tree called the Wretched, that's inspired by Beloved and and Frantz Fanon's work, The Wretched of the Earth. So it's like, you know, all these, they're references to literature, but they also have this very dark, sensuous kind of familiarity to them, you know? Like the Nobody, the one behind me, is about the hollowing out of Black culture and the reselling of Black culture. And I got it from that song, Nobody Knows the Trouble I Seen, you know, which is why the first chapter is called The Trouble I Seen, you know? But anyway, so those are some of the things. And then so what happens is we're working on this. I was supposed to be the artist on the entire series. That didn't work out because what happened was, you know, me and Damian Duffy started working on Kindred. I ended up getting married, curated a massive show with Ronaldo Anderson, moved across the country, blah, blah, blah. You know, all this stuff happened, right? So we decided to bring in people like Stanford and other collaborators to help us. And so it became more of an anthology series. And so the main narrative is about Lindsay Ford, who is a PhD student at Berkeley, and she's doing research on folklore, Black folklore, and she comes across this box that her grandfather told her about, and then she realizes that it's not actually made up. It actually is a real thing, and she starts tracking it across the world, you know. But then she realizes that she's connected to it in some way, and so that's when it gets really terrifying. You'll see in the second, because I just sent you all the second chapter, so. And yeah, it gets real bad. But those are some of the things that we started unpacking, is exploring Black history and trauma, but also what is the difference between justice and revenge, you know, these types of things. And how does acting out of revenge change you as a person, you know, to know what the outcome is and still do it, you know. And Lindsay is forced to actually make those choices, unfortunately, too, right? So it's like, it's someone who understands the weapon that they have, and then also being enticed by the power of that weapon, you know. So it's a morality tale too. So,
Stanford, what would you like to unbox from the Box of Bones?
Well, I mean, what I thought was what's also interesting about Box of Bones is what happened when John reached out and started saying, okay, let's see if we can bring in all these other people, right? I mean, there was a moment where I would say working on it felt like just a giant jam session, right? I mean, where, you know, I mean, how many people were involved, John? Like 29?
Man, it's the whole, yeah. I mean, totally, it was probably like more close to 20 people, because you had like tourists, you had people writing essays, you had people drawing, you had people coloring, helping with coloring. We had letterers, you know, Damian Duffy, and he lettered, I think, 2 chapters, and then we got, you know, a gentleman from Barbados, actually, Jeremy Marshall, became our letterer for the rest of it. So, you know, we even had like, we did have a diasporic team of people working, you know.
And one of the things I also remember about it, John, was you know, we're working on it during the summer, and I remember I was doing like a really long bike ride, like a training ride. It was like a 65-mile ride, and we talked for like, you and I talked for about 40 miles of that ride. Right.
Wow.
But the ride started during the day, and I didn't get home until after midnight. So like, we're talking about this horror book while I'm riding alone on a bike in the dark. um and I remember that, and I also I remember how that kind of inspired me, like when I wrote the intro, to really start thinking, to write the intro, not just in terms of an intro for the book, but to also try and capture the production side of it,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
terms of how the very act of working on this book was exposing the creators to racial trauma.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
And I remember, John, you talking about how like there are times when your drawing trauma and the drawing of trauma traumatized you.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that, and then when I, you know, and you'll see it in the intro if you read it, is that like, is it starts with that, but then it also goes into you know, looking at the monsters, like, really I started asking, what is this line between you know, between embodying something to become a monster and being born. And once you go from embodiment to being born, then there's issues of agency and desire and sentience, and that's what I was thinking about in terms of like when I was writing the intro. You know, and there's something really horrific when you start thinking of a monster in that way. It actually makes it worse, because you're like, oh, this monster has feelings. Oh,
Yeah. The
like,
monster. Yeah, it's funny because, you know, the root word for monster is monstrum, right? Which really, like, literally means a warning or a portent, you know, which is interesting to me because, like, the gods are displeased, you know, and they send a monster to punish us, you know, and that's where the monster comes from. So when you think about like this box of monsters, like, which god sent them, which thing ancestors, right? And then who are they punishing, you know, and why?
right.
You know, these are the things. But yeah, I mean, to your point, Stanford, I mean, like, yeah, we started really thinking a lot about, you know, the manifestations of trauma, and then, but how people were excited to work on the book too. That's the other thing. Like when we would describe it to people, they're like, "Yo, I really want to help. I want to help with this," you know. And fortunately, I was a, you know, like you said, I was a fellow at Harvard, and so I actually was able to utilize a lot of my funds to actually create a studio, essentially, you know, to like very much like a scientist would have like a lab of people working with them. It was a very similar thing. And like Stanford, it was like a jam session. So people were actually we're making stipend, we're getting paid by Harvard to work on this big monster book, you know. And honestly, and I was thinking about this, I mean, this is the largest independent like book project I've ever worked on in my career, you know, because as far as like just the span of it, you know, as far as like just how long I've been working on it and how many people, it's the book that actually made me realize that I could be an art director on a book, you know, like for real, like managing that many people from different backgrounds, different timelines, different stylistic tendencies, going through artists who like would start and stop, you know, on books, or like would say they were going to do the book and drop off the book. It was just like a bunch of, yeah, it was a bunch of stuff. And just on chapter 7, I had 3 artists attached to it, and none of them came through until Barrington Edwards stepped up and said, "I'm going to do this book." I was like, wow. And he just totally killed it. You'll see when you look at the pages, you know. And then trying to figure out how to bring it home. And you know what's really funny about it is that we've been working on it for so long. And then like when Bill said, "Hey, we need to put this book out," I realized like, wow, we're almost done with this book. You know, it's just like been we've been, you know, pecking away at it for years. And then you realize like, wait a minute, this book is done actually. And then to look at the breadth of the work and just like, you know, it's exciting to see. I'm very proud of it, actually. Box of Bones Volume 2, and actually, you know, Volume 1 as an expression. it's really interesting to see like the story come to bear. And now we've actually successfully created an entirely new universe, which is very exciting. So.
Well, I want to be mindful of our time and make sure we don't take up all of your day. What I'd like to sort of do here, pivot, is to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the things that you're working on now, that you're excited about, that you want the space to tell people in it. Could be ethnogothic related, could be tangential. I'll leave that.
Okay. So one of the things I'm really excited about is the release of Ghostlight's, the Marvel Ghostlight book as a trade paperback, which is going to be September 27th as a collection. When I was at Comic-Con, there were so many people that were congratulating. It's like, congratulations on that Silver Surfer book. I haven't read it. I'm waiting for the trade. So I'm hoping that, people will check out the trade. That's essentially it was an opportunity to create a brand new Black superhero for Marvel, which is insane. So that's cool. I'm looking forward to finishing up Parable of the Talents, which we're into now. And actually, when I'm leaving here, I'm gonna eat lunch and I'm gonna go up to my office and ink hopefully 2 to 3 pages today. So David Brame, who was a main artist on Box of Bones, has been helping with layouts, so it's been amazing. Let's see. I edited a book with Marvel and Abrams called Marvel Super Stories that comes out in October, so that's gonna be cool. I'm very excited about the second volume of Box of Bones coming out. Like I said, it's going to press today, which is awesome. So it'll be out in stores and available in October, just in time for for the scary times. I have 2 projects that are like, one is going to be with Image, the other one's going to be with Vault. Can't really talk too much about them, but I will be writing like some short horror fiction for comics, which I'm very excited about. And then I'm working on a graphic novel with Novel Hopkinson and Stephen Bissett called Night Comes Walking, which definitely is an ethnogothic story because it features, the legendary Zora Hurston as a paranormal investigator, and set in the 50s. And so it's me, Novel Hopkinson, and Steve Bissett, who, as you know, co-created John Constantine, and he's an illustrator for Swamp Thing. So those are some really cool things I'm very excited about. And that's hopefully some other stuff on the horizon, but that's just kind of like a snapshot of things I'm excited about.
Excellent. So I will shiver in anticipation for all of those.
Yes, they're coming your way. So,
Stanford, any final wrap-up remarks you want to make?
Well, let's see. I'm working on this class called Exploring the Ethnogothic. You may encounter it sometime. I'm doing that. I'm also finishing up a book for Fantagraphics on Black superheroes. The working title, we're deciding between 2 working titles. One is All of My Feelings About Black Comic Books, or Black Comics, because it does comic books and strips, and the other is Unleashing the Black Imagination. So so we're coming down the home stretch on that. So that's just been occupying most of my time. I'm really looking forward to, because I'm assuming that we're going to be looking at this at the beginning of the class. I'm really looking forward to seeing the reactions of all of our students and all the public who just decides to wander in. I think it's going to make for a really good time. I'm also looking forward to what we're able to make happen around the ethnogothic at the Normal Theater after the class is over. And I'm excited about the fact that I have it on good information that that you, Eric, and you, John, will be doing something with me during spooky season that everybody in Normal will have access to.
That's pretty awesome.
Well, Professor Jennings, Dr. Carpenter, thank you for joining me today. And thank you all listening at home.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.